All right, now we're going to talk about virtual instruments. Now, what's a virtual instrument? Well, in order to adequately describe what we're talking about when we say virtual instruments, we're going to have to go way back to the 1980s, to the dawn of personal computing via graphical user interface, or GUI. There were two companies who were the first to make a graphical user interface for a personal computer: Apple and Microsoft. And we won't get into who came up with it first. They kind of came up at the same time, and they both stole it from a company called Xerox, which you may recognize from people who make copy machines. They had an experimental division of their company, and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were both invited over and basically stole the idea of having a graphical user interface for a computer. The original idea came from this really kind of sterile 1980s office environment, which makes it really unattractive for somebody like a musician or a creator, painter, anybody that's an artist. And it feels like a very sterile and dead environment. And to be fair, computers have not really been able to recreate the art studio inside of a computer. So what we're doing in this course is to use the computer as a conduit for your creative energy. So this is going to get a little philosophical for a second here. So essentially what you're doing is through these what they call peripheral devices, whether it's a mouse or a keyboard, and I have this tablet over here that I use with a pen. I use both pointing devices at once because it eases my use of the computer. What you're doing in this course is you're projecting your musicality into the computer, and there's lots of ways to get that musicality into the computer. You could actually write in the notes with your mouse, click around and put them in manually. You could also play the keyboard in Ableton. Actually, this is a function. You could play musical notes with the computer keyboard. Personally, I think it's more interesting to make music with a computer and more fluid, and it's a language as a musician that makes sense to me to have a pad controller or a keyboard controller to channel my musical energy into the computer. With a virtual instrument, essentially all it is the receiver of that musical information. So you're playing a chord or a note on a keyboard, you are triggering a virtual instrument inside of the computer, and that virtual instrument makes a sound. And that sound comes back at you through speakers or headphones. And so what you're doing is you're creating a feedback loop of your musical process with the computer. A very similar situation is happening with actual acoustic musical instruments like a piano. When you press a key, the sound comes back at you when you hit the key, and it's an instantaneous thing. That's why before I was talking about latency and how important it is to get that latency number as low as possible in order to have as fluid as a musical experience as possible. You need to have that instant feedback. In the way that Microsoft Windows and Mac OS virtualized the 1980s office environment, we're going to be virtualizing our studio environment, our music studio, our recording studio, whatever is our creative zone is going to be now in the computer. Not everything. You can still have a room full of musical instruments. You're not letting anything go here. You are just easing the use of your studio and expanding the library of things you're able to do with what you have. Instead of having a room full of equipment and people, you have the computer. It's much more consistent, especially when you're trying to get ideas out quickly, to be able to use a very simple virtual instrument that will represent pretty accurately what that instrument would sound like in your computer.